So it's my pleasure today to present our own Dan Batovici from TeTra online seminar. Dan is a research associate at UCLouvain and a research collaborator in Louvain. In 2015, he defended his PhD with a thesis on early Christian Greek papyri and currently works and publishes on the manuscripts of the so-called Apostolic Fathers. He edited with Maddalena Tocca the volume quoting translation about the versions of late antique Christian literature, which was published by Brill, and recently co-edited a thematic issue of Ephemeridis Theologicae Louvainienses on the ancient translations of the Apostolic Fathers, and this will be soon out, actually, this month. His current project focuses on the Coptic and the Syrac reception of these writings, and today he will present something on this theme, actually the Clementine Catholic Epistles in Syriac. So Dan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for a very kind introduction. Hello everyone, we're good to see most of you again, and welcome to my paper. I will try to share my screen. With a bit of luck, I will even manage to pull it off. Nearly there. At the moment, I imagine you're not seeing the full presentation, but now there is a chance that you do. I'm also admitting people, so this can happen a bit. Okay. The background for this paper would be my project on the, like Valentina said, on the reception of the so-called Apostolic Fathers in Coptic and Syriac. And what is interesting about First and Second Clement, these are very briefly, two documents from early Christianity. What we call First Clement is a letter from the Church of Rome to the Church of Corinth, asking them to address some problems that have appeared there. It's only later been attached to the name of Clement of Rome, and Second Clement, it's even less so, letter of Clement of Rome, and it's probably not even a letter. The most important thing, the thing most known about the transmission of these two letters is the fact that they appear in a 5th century biblical pandect, Codex Alexandrinus, at the end of the New Testament, raising the question of whether they would have been, for whoever made that codex, canonical. This happened in the 5th century. The premise of this paper is simple. First and Second Clement are copied together in one 12th century Syriac biblical manuscript, where they are put in as Catholic Epistles before the Pauline corpus, and this is often regarded as an isolated curiosity, only loosely linked to the reception of these letters in early Christianity. My aim today is to disrupt a bit that image. So I'll present 3 New Testament Syriac manuscript contexts for Clement of Rome. I will discuss the relationship between them and propose a more clearly defined, probably as probable explanation as to why they were, in the 12th century, copied into a New Testament manuscript in which were grouped with the Catholic Epistles and, as you'll see, as Catholic Epistles. First off, the so-called Buchanan Bible. This splendid 12th century biblical pandect from Tirabdin is known to all the Syriacists in the room, has representations of presumed authors and main characters, and sometimes biblical scenes throughout in both the Old and the New Testament, including Ruth, Esther, or Judith. Here in the middle, mid-beheading. On the right, there is James before his letter. He's not often represented, so I thought I'll add him in here. And at the end, And that at the end would be Clement, represented before the Clementine writings and after the ending of Jude. However, unlike in Codex Alexandrinus, the one that I mentioned at the beginning, what follows are not first and second Clement, but the so-called 8 books of Clement. This is the order of books. I imagine scholars of pseudepigraphy will be interested that First Peter and First John are copied first, then Second Peter and Second John. Clement is represented here with the apostolic connection stated in the inscription on the image and in the title of the work right under it. Both paratexts mention Clement, the disciple of Peter, as is often the case with the apostolic fathers, and a few other texts. Now, the Clementine Octateuch is broadly speaking a book of church and ecclesiastical canons, but really a composite of various texts in different genres that are only in Syriac attributed to Clement as a whole. In other traditions, only parts of it are associated with Clement, and the collection tends to have different configurations in different traditions. An interesting detail is that at the very end of the Octateuch, the 8 books of Clement, there are the so-called apostolic canons, last sections of which offers a list of all the New Testament books that includes First and Second Clement, as well as the Octateuch itself, written in the first person. In the image on the left, it's from a different manuscript, as the Buchanan Bible lacks the two last books broken off. This is a bit strange. It is a different canon list than, say, that of Athanasius of Alexandria, in as much as this one is written in the first person as Clement, and includes in the New Testament canon the Clementine writings and even the book that contains the list. I'll pick on this matter later on. For now, I turn to the second example. The Cambridge manuscript. So the second we can witness I'll briefly present today is largely contemporary with the Buchanan Bible. Cambridge additional manuscript 1700 is a Syriac New Testament that has First and Second Clement copied within as Catholic Epistles. The title of First Clement copied on the same page with the ending of Jude and adorned with similar motifs is the Catholic Epistle of Clement, the disciple of Peter, the apostle, to the Church of the Corinthians. As in the previous case, the derived apostolicity is present in paratext. In any case, the Clementine letters, again, I'm making the point, is copied after Jude and before Paul. What makes this an even more interesting witness is the fact that it is a liturgical manuscript, in the sense that it includes a liturgical apparatus throughout and tables of readings at the beginning, and the Clementine letters are included in both. Indeed, sections from First and Second Clement are assigned as reading for 17 Sundays after Easter, after Resurrection, with the apparatus embedded in the text and not added later on, as we have in other manuscripts. In the image on the right, whatever section of First Clement comes after the read title would have been read in the 39th Sunday after Resurrection. Interesting as it may be, there is really no background to this practice. The colophon only says that it was copied by Sochdo, the meanest monk in Edessa. And Lightfoot's conclusion is that so far as regards the scribe himself, the Clementine epistles are put on an absolute equality with the canonical readings. We might extend this to whoever ordered or overseen the production of the manuscript, or perhaps to the community of Sochdo, the meanest monk in Edessa. There are, however, 2 points of separation. There is a Philoxenian subscription after Jude that presumably is relevant for the Catholic Epistles before it, and which does not include the Clementine letters, referring to the Catholic Epistles, and the colophon at the end of the manuscript, from which we learn the date of completion and the name of the scribe, refers to the manuscript as the life-giving book of the Gospel and of the Acts of the Holy Apostles, and the two epistles of Clement, together with the teachings of Paul. If Lightfoot is correct that the title, the Acts of the Holy Apostles, includes, obviously, he says, the Catholic Epistles, when even the scribe himself, Sogdo, the mean monk, seems to have regarded the Clementine letters as a bit apart from the rest. Nevertheless, on all counts, it's a very, very interesting artifact. There is then, rather than the epistles on chastity attributed to Clement, also copied in New Testament manuscripts. Until recently, they were known from only one manuscript of the 15th century, edited by Balen in 1856. The title, however, is simply the letter of the blessed Clement, the disciple of Peter. Normally, this is attributed to mere confusion. First and second Clement were meant, these two were taken in by mistake. In the meantime, however, a series of witnesses have emerged, some more ancient, not more ancient than the manuscript used by Balen, but very interesting is Karakosh I, which seems to have only survived in the photographs of Vobus, which he had taken during his trips in the Middle East in the 60s. He didn't photograph the whole manuscript, only the books that he was interested in, and we're lucky that he included the two Clementine letters, and that's his shoe right there. So there are other manuscripts now. The earliest is nearly contemporary with the Buchanan Bible and the Cambridge manuscript, 1700, additional 1700. It's of the 13th century. These witnesses stem from and in part still belong to the same milieu. Looking at the contents of these manuscripts, perhaps we see the migration of the Clementine letters from the end of a New Testament to right before Paul in the process of copying and rearranging these collections. In any case, whenever we see these Clementine letters in Syriac, they have the title, The Letters of the Blessed Clement, the disciple of Peter, with the apostolic connection clearly stated. In the light of this, there are at least three questions to be asked. What's the relationship between the two letters on chastity and first and second Clement? Why are there Clementine writings copied with the New Testament at all? And what's the trajectory of reception here? Which lead to what? To start with the first, what is the relationship between the two sets of Clementine letters? Lightfoot speaks of confusion, but that was on the basis of the knowledge of one witness at that time. The two sets of letters do in fact overlap briefly earlier in Syriac, very early on. There are a series of excerpts from various Clementine writings scattered in early Syriac patristic collections, and the oldest in the British Library, additional 12,156, dated to the 6th century, contains 3 such fragments. One from the first letter on chastity, and 2 from second Clement. Interestingly, the first excerpt is explicitly introduced as stemming from Clement's letter about chastity, and 2 from Clement are introduced as coming from the third letter of Clement. It would seem that the late antique compiler reflected in this 6th century manuscript, knew of at least 3 letters of Clement, and the name of the letters on virginity, perhaps, if that's not just a descriptor. But that knowledge seems lost later on. In medieval times, based on the 6 witnesses we now know, it seems that the epistles on chastity continued to be copied for several centuries, from the 13th to the 19th, as the letters of Clement, with no trace of correction, so far as I can tell. It would seem overall that, at least in the context of these witnesses, there was no obvious knowledge of 1st and 2nd Clement. But why, then, the second question, why the Clementine text with the New Testament at all? When scholars try to account for the presence of 1st and 2nd Clement in a Syriac New Testament manuscript, even briefly, they normally go by accumulation, listing the Cambridge manuscript as the last among the reception historical landmarks where the letters seems to be taken as authoritative in some ways. But these are usually from early Christianity and Greek. Perhaps we can be more specific on the matter. Codex Alexandrinus, for instance, is not a very good parallel. It's very old compared to the Syriac New Testament discussed here. In their time in Greek, the 2 letters in the time of the New Testament manuscript, Syriac manuscript discussed here, the 2 letters were copied with other apostolic fathers and not with the New Testament. How about the last apostolic canons in the apostolic constitutions then, and its list of biblical books that concludes the Octateuch of Clement in Syriac? The apostolic canons are transmitted in 2 manners in Syriac: as a separate book integrated in ecclesiastical canonical collections of conciliar acta and documenta. A couple of books are often included in such collections, and as the Octateuch of Clement, virtually always copied in biblical pandects, like the Buchanan Bible. In both branches, the list of books is the same, here on the left. The list seems pretty much to be pretty much the same in all witnesses. An exception is Deir al-Syrian manuscript 31, where James is apparently moved down the list a little bit, but even that is a small difference. I derived that information from the catalog. In any case, the connection, the attachment of Clement to Jude is preserved in virtually all Syriac witnesses of the apostolic canons. Elsewhere, the items in this list float about a little bit more. The Greek list does not link Jude with Clement, and apparently no Greek witness does. The Coptic list, on a different branch, has a different configuration and places the Clementines after the Book of Revelation. As such, the connection to Jude seems to be peculiar to Syriac. The context is the following. The Octateuch of Clement was translated in Syriac in the 7th century, possibly by Jacob of Edessa, the polymath of the time. And in this tradition, unlike in others, this peculiar group of documents is an unitary work placed under the authorship of Clement. Several of the 8 books are included right away in the ecclesiastical canonical collections. We have witnesses from a century later, and these are effectively the ecclesiastical canon law corpus of the West Syrian Church, and it includes the apostolic canons and the biblical list and the end of it. Moreover, the estimated date of translation for 1st and 2nd Clement is, I believe, the 8th century. So, a last look at the position of the Clementine writings in Syriac manuscript. For the Octateuch as a whole, the solution was simple, and it was used fairly consistently, copied in biblical pandects after the New Testament, virtually always after Jude. On the other hand, first and second Clement is copied, are copied in the middle of it. That poses us with a problem. How did we get to that? Perhaps we can derive a parallel from the way the two letters on chastity were treated, since there, in that case, several witnesses have survived. The oldest witnesses of them has the letters on virginity at the end as the Octateuch, but subsequent compilers moved it in, connecting it to the Catholic Epistles and in particular to Jude. One way or another, the same thing happened with first and second Clement and their placement in the Cambridge manuscript. It is just that for the other two letters, we can sort of see the process. So to conclude, what is the trajectory of reception here? The most intuitive way is, of course, to start from the oldest texts, whose ancestry and authority lead to other writings being composed and placed under the name of their author, writings that fed on the initial aura of the character. In this case, the Clementine writings in Syriac, it seems to go the other way around. It seems that the growing importance of the 8 pseudo-Clementine books in Syriac and in different forms in Arabic and Ethiopic influenced, at least in some ways, if not directly, the eventual episodic emergence of first and second Clement in Syriac. In a sense, the pseudographic writings have influenced, if I'm correct, the reception of the older, slightly more genuine writings. Now back to the representation of Clement in the Buchanan Bible. So if the iconographic program is one in which the Old Testament is a prefiguration of the New Testament, where is this reading of the imagery present in the Buchanan Bible, then we can add a bemol. The Buchanan Bible also makes a next step where the Old Testament and the New Testament offer an ecclesiastical grounding. Clement is staying on a similar chair as Mark, copying a book from a peculiar book stand, but the marked difference is that Clement wears the ecclesiastical garment and not the apostolic garments as the apostles are represented earlier in the manuscript. And with that, I thank you for your attention and for joining in.
Thank you very much, Dan, for this fascinating and rich presentation. I open now the floor for discussion. If you have questions or remarks, please either raise your electronic hand or type it in the chat. We'll take a look at both, but maybe I can start us off with a rather broad question, if I may, because if I got it correctly, I saw on your slide that the Coptic reception does not have the 8 books attributed to Clementine. And so I was wondering, can you tell us a bit more about the relationship between the Syrac and the Coptic tradition and whether one is dependent on the other?
So I haven't looked in much detail into how we got the Syriac translation as we have, but they seem to be a very unstable type of document. They are stable in Syriac probably because they were copied as translated as coming from one author. Maybe that led to some sort of unity, but in other traditions, only sections out of the broader collection were attributed to Clement. And there are very different type of documents within, including apocalyptical works and other regulations and orders. And I think each of them, I think the Syriac, if I'm correct, comes from the Greek, as does the Coptic, but independently. And it's not clear to me if what we have in Syriac is a lost Greek type of this collection that has not survived in the Greek, or whether this is something that happened with the process of translation. And then it kept unitary. With that,
yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. Timothy,
sure.
Please.
Yeah, Dan, this is really fascinating. And I had a couple of questions. You were just talking about the relation to potential relations with Coptic and Greek. Is the Ethiopic Clementine Octateuch the same as the Syriac or developed from the Syriac? Because you said the whole thing was not attributed to Clement. Is that right? That was the first question.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Go ahead.
No, please.
Well, the second question was the places where either First and Second Clement or the Epistles in Virginity appear in the manuscripts. It looked like, and you gave a couple screenshots of the titles and colophons. Are they ever referred to using the term Catholic the way that Catholic epistles typically are in these New Testament pandects? I suspect not, or people would have noticed that by now, but maybe not. And then also the British Library additional 12-156, where it mentions, that's absolutely fascinating, where it's clear that it knows both the Epistles to Virginity and, or at least two of those, and at least one other Clementine epistle. What kind of manuscript is that? That's not a New Testament pandect, is it? It's something else.
Yeah. So to the first question, Ethiopic, it's not my field. It would be lovely one day. What I've read of it, there are several concurrent collections over time, and some of them are completely attributed to Clement. But that closest to what we have in Syriac. So we don't have the exact collection that we have in Syriac in Ethiopic. So it's not clear if it comes from Syriac and it's rearranged, or it comes from a different direction. To me, it's not clear to me. But I've read a couple of overviews of what's happening in Syriac, and there are several complete collection. And when we get one that's fully called Octateuch of Clement, it's a different thing than what we have in Syriac. It seems the nature of this collection is to change a bit, moving around. So this is what I can say. There are probably others in the room that can say more today, Ethiopic. And the second question, the only Catholic name that we have, it's in the Cambridge manuscript. The title to the first Clement there says not only the first letter to Clement, says the first Catholic letter. It just has that word in there. You do have it as a descriptor in the superscription title. It's not picked up on for Second Clement, in the sense that the title for Second Clement, it's one of those that repeat. It's the second of the same to the same. But in all respects, it goes like that. The title is there. Whether we should imagine that the scribe or whoever is responsible for that title had in mind the same associations that we have when we say that some letter is Catholic in the context of the New Testament is unclear. But because because there are also, they do look the same with the other, they are used in the same manner as the New Testament writings, but then again, there are two sort of places where they are separated from the rest, were singled out, First and Second Clement, in the same manuscript. It's in this case, it's one of those words that it's complicated for us, for me, to empty them when we use them and not imagine the same connections, today's connections when we say Catholic, which is why I played on, of course, for the title. But whether they would have thought like we think of this, I don't know. Thank you.
And I see that there is
a...
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
British Library manuscript from the 6th century.
Yeah.
What is that?
That's it's not a New Testament. It's a collection of excerpts. The section that these are in, it's just a collection of patristic excerpts. So it's 5 lines on 4 columns or whatever. It's not the full text, but they come one after another, these 3 excerpts, and they have titles in front, and that title says, the first letter of Clement for what we would say the Virginitate Unum first, and the third letter about Second Clement, which is strange, and it's found elsewhere in patristic literature. Very briefly, weird reference to Second Clement as the third letter. We'll have to look that a bit more.
Is that a translation?
Of?
Is that 6th century British Library manuscript translated from the Greek, or is that a Syriac composition?
I'm not aware of any Greek counterpart to that particular collection. I think it's normally regarded as a translation and Syriac compilation, but I'm not sure entirely.
Yes.
So yeah, one thing that I didn't say is that the 2 letters on chastity have only survived in Syriac. There are traces in Greek, in Coptic, and but in full they only survived in Syriac. These are the witnesses that we have, and it hasn't been re-edited since Bellen's edition of 1856 or something, and that was on only 1 manuscript.
I think Andy wants to add something to that.
Marcin wrote something.
Yeah, Marcin gave us a reference for the Ethiopic tradition. There is Alessandro Bausi.
Yeah. That's what I read about that.
If you want to expand, please do so. Otherwise, Andy and Valentina afterwards.
Just wanted to point out that Timothy was asking about a 6th century manuscript in the British Library, and you're talking about 12,156, which is the 9th century compilation, the Florilegium. I can't remember the 6th century manuscript, Dan, that you were talking about. That was something else, and that was what Timothy was asking about. Just to point out that there was a bit of a difference between.
Yeah. I'm trying to find now.
On your slide, Dan, you've got
that would be my mistake. I put it as a 6th century. I apologize for that. Thanks, Andy.
What's the actual? That's the.
Andy, what's the actual?
I think it's 9th century, but I'm not 100% sure. Something like that.
Okay.
Great, thank you. Valentina, please.
Yes, thanks a lot, Dan. I have a more general question, like out of curiosity and not knowing this text. So at the end, you mentioned the fact of how the apocryphal influenced the inclusion of the authentic writing, if I got you correctly. Can you expand a bit on this issue?
Well, thank you very much. That's precisely the thing. The way this writing, the 1st and 2nd Clement in Syriac are described normally people did not work very much on those, apart from Lightfoot and a few others. They are mentioned in introductions to 1st Clement among the witnesses, or also among the places in which 1st and 2nd Clement are regarded as important early Christian writings. And we normally think we go from old to new. It's because we have something old and big that letters and other books were written under the same name, the way it happens in Apocrypha. But it's not inconceivable that in time the tables are changed and the old writing is lost, forgotten, and the young ones, that's pretty common actually. But sometimes it can push further, and it's not at least inconceivable that because the Octateus, the pseudo Clementine writing gain momentum in one space, that also the older writings got a fresh view. I have an example from the Coptic. It's not as clear, I mean, it's even less clear than the Syriac, but still serves as some sort of example. We have there two manuscripts of Ignatius of Antioch, and they are of the 11th centuries, I think, both of them. Nothing before, nothing after. But the martyrdom of Ignatius, on the other hand, which is a later text, and one can imagine why it circulated more and at some point was more interested in the initial writings. We have some 6 or 7 witnesses, and they start from the 5th century, and they cover 5th, 6th, 7th up to the 11th. Perhaps there we can see a bit of the same, the importance of the hagiographical literature and the martyrological transmission of texts pointed to the initial older texts that were sought for. I don't know if translated later. But in this case, in Syriac, I think it fits. I haven't looked yet with enough detail into the dating of the translation of 1st and 2nd Clement, but I think the proposals of 8th century that are in circulation would work as well, slightly after the Octateuch.
Okay, yeah, no, thanks a lot. It clarified things.
Okay, thanks, Andy.
Yeah, so Andy wrote in the chat that is 6th century, actually, the manuscript, the British Library manuscript.
As I suspect. No.
Okay, so it's a 6th century manuscript. We got that sorted.
Still a florilegium, like he said, of excerpts from the fathers. There's also, I think, in the same manuscripts, in a couple of manuscripts like that, is also associated with there are the excerpts from Clement, weird as they are, and then Ignatius and Polycarp. It's one of the few places where you get 3 apostolic fathers mentioned after one another, and then normal patristic authors. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question.
Please.
If I recall correctly, you mentioned that I think it was this manuscript with the excerpt that has a mention of 3rd Clementine, and that's the only mention that we have. Do you know whether it's the same also in direct tradition and transmission? So that's the only reference we have to a 3rd Clement. Did you have a chance to look into that?
So for this reference to the 3rd Clement is strange, because it's particularly strange because it means what we call today the 2nd Clement, the old text. What follows is the beginning, and then again from the 9th chapter or something. And I think I saw recently in Lightfoot a reference to at least one patristic author that refers to the 3rd letter of Clement, and again, what they mean is what we describe today as 2nd Clement. I'll have to look that in more detail to see if that stands. But the point is that in the context of whoever created the 6th manuscript, Florilegium, there was the notion that there are 3 letters of Clement, and the first letter, what is designated as the first letter, actually that's not mentioned. The first letter, what we call today the first letter of on chastity, is there put with the letter on chastity, and what we know today as 2nd Clement is put as the 3rd letter. And the question is, they did not know 1st Clement at all. So the 2 letters that are not mentioned there are the 2nd on chastity and our 1st Clement. They speak of 3, which is the 2nd then. And it is not clear to me. It could be that 1st Clement was imagined, because it's not saying, I think, the first letter on chastity. It just says the letter on chastity, and I think this is the same. No, I'm making a confusion with what I was going to add, and stop myself right in time. But yeah, it's unclear what happened there. They did know of them together, and that hasn't happened in anywhere else.
Okay, let's see. Thank you. Thank you very much for
Thank
that.
you.
Professor
Thank you.
Verheiden has the next question.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Two questions. This so-called Clementine octatoig, is this transmitted in the Syriac outside of your biblical manuscripts that you've been looking into? I don't remember it exactly, and I can't find right away the data for that. And the second, what is the link with the pseudo-Clementines? Do they play a role in that? They are also in part preserved in the, at least the Recognitiones, in the Syriac tradition, as you know, and very old manuscript and so. How does that link to each other there? Because what you call the octatoig, is that the pseudo-Clementines, or is it more? Is it like this Ethiopic octatoig, which is partly overlapping, but I would say loosely overlapping only, with certain elements from the pseudo-Clementines, as we have them in Greek and in Latin?
Yeah, loosely overlapping, it's the right word on this. It's mainly transmitted, the 8 book of Clements are mainly transmitted in Syria, so far as I can tell, in 2 forms. One of them is at the end of pandect, and it's the whole thingy. I have in mind some 5 cases, could be more. And the other are collections of church orders that start with.
That's where you expect them to be,
Yes, but there is not the whole octateuch. It's like 4 or 6 books that are put in various places at the beginning, I think, mostly, and then thrown in. And these are the 2, and they start very, very early. The Church of the 13 Martyrs, 309 and 3010, both of them are such manuscripts, where you get at some point also the Ignatian, what I refer to as the Ignatian canons. The excerpts from Ignatius in Syria, some of them. And the connection to the rest of the pseudo-Clementine literature, I haven't seen it yet.
Because there is a letter, as you know, there is a letter of Clement in these 3 letters that precede the pseudo-Clementines in the Syriac,
those are
editions.
Yet another group of letters, yes.
Yeah, you have Peter, you have James, and you have Clement, who is very apologetic about himself there in this letter, actually. He's creating himself as the successor of Peter there. Does that play a role to get them into a Bible?
That may well do. That may well do. I mean, the oldest, from what I know, the oldest dated Syriac manuscript contains also, among other things, some parts of the recognition, I think.
In the Syriac version, what you have at least.
Yes, indeed. So that was there too. It was a looser connection for me to introduce as the cause for first and second Clement popping up in the 12th century than the octateuch. So I didn't bring it up in this paper, but I will be mentioning, because yes, they circulate in Syriac, and very important. The figure which is behind all this dynamic, the figure of a Clement of Rome, it's also reinforced by the pseudo-Clementine literature. But I haven't seen the other type of pseudo-Clementine that you're referring to. I haven't seen any connection between them, either in the way they are copied in manuscripts, like in the place, or in lists, or in grouped in another ways. As you know, because we co-edited together the thematic issue of ephemerides that Valentina mentioned at the beginning. It's in Latin that we have First Clement alone, copied with a bit of pseudo-Clementine literature of that kind. And that's precisely one in which, even there, First Clement is not the first title in the Codex. The discourse, as it is constructed in that Codex, is of course one that presses the primacy of the Pope, and that's not constructed by putting First Clement, but James' letter, pseudo-epigraphical letter, and a bit of the recognitions, and a bit of Rufinus' preface to it, and then First Clement is lucky enough to get in there. That might be another example where we get First Clement because these things are more important. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just a quick question. The connection to Judah, if I recall correctly, is mainly in Syrac, right? It's not as tight in the other traditions. Can you expand a little bit more on why do you think that is? If you have any ideas on that.
Well, one thing is, thank you. One thing is that in Syriac for New Testament lips, you don't really get revelation. In Coptic and in Greek, that was not necessarily a problem, had revelation in, which means First and Second Clement tend to be in different places. So not linked with the, but I really couldn't tell. I just look at the data and notice that this connection appears always there, but is never made more explicit than the list at the end of the Yoke of Tateuch. And more explicit than that, I have not found it. Well, probably is somewhere, and I would be very, very happy if somebody would point it to me. A discussion in a Syriac author where they put these things together or separating them. But it's just a thing, it's there in Syriac and you can see it, and it's not elsewhere, not in the same consistent manner. Perhaps something can come out of it. This is why I pushed on it. Thank you.
I see. Thank you. Timothy.
So Georgia, actually picking up on what you were asking just now about Jude, and what Dan was talking about, I mean, we all know the minor Catholic epistles are not part of this earliest Syriac New Testament translations, and the Apocalypse of John isn't either. And I'm thinking back to this 12156 manuscript in the British Library, the 6th century manuscript, clearly containing things in a Syriac milieu and Syriac compositions and translations, and mentioning the epistles in virginity and at least one of either First or Second Clement. Either Lightfoot or Kennett kind of thought the Syriac translations of First and Second Clement may have been 7th or 8th century. And I wonder if this might be kind of a hint that it's happening somewhat earlier. And then if we think about the minor Catholics getting translated into Syriac at some point, you know, I mean, are these two somehow connected? Is kind of the filling out of the Syriac, the filling out of the Catholic epistles in the New Testament with the minor Catholics. I mean, do they also say, well, let's fill it out with First and Second Clement too around the same time? I mean, I'm not sure how I would prove that, but it's very tempting to see something going on there.
Yeah, thank you. That is interesting. And the first thing that comes to mind is that in some of the New Testament, older New Testament manuscripts or Bible manuscripts where we have in Syriac, like in the Buchanan Bible, you don't have First Peter and then Second Peter and then John and First John and then Third. You have First Peter and then First John. But if I remember correctly, it has to do with the type of revision of the translation. You have colophons in there saying that this, like they belong to First Peter and First John, they belong to one recension of the Syriac New Testament and the other to the other. So it might be that they just took them at some point from different manuscripts. It could be, like you say, in steps, a matter of authority, but it could be also a thing of where did they take them from which collection, and whether they expanded the core Catholic epistles into the minor one, and whether, while we're at it, might as well add in the nice to Clementine. Your guess is as good as mine. Yeah, it could be. But the idea, the notion that, if I'm correct from what I know, that they are different recensions of the Syriac translation, when it's more mechanical than a sort of more mechanical move rather than one of authority, canonical, we're going to add only this and only that, could be explained in other ways than an expanding canon. I don't know, but yeah, interesting.
My understanding was that it was, really before the Herclean, that the minor Catholics in the Apocalypse just weren't translated. And maybe there's something newer on that I'm not familiar with.
No,
that was my understanding. And I think we wouldn't have to view them necessarily, the expansion, if that's what it was, of the Catholics to include the minor Catholics in the Syriac. We wouldn't have to imagine that always included 1 and 2 Clement. But if we already have this expansion going on, and if the translation of 1 and 2 Clement was in fact earlier than the 7th or 8th century, as was thought, perhaps
them already there. Yeah, that could be. I'll have to think a bit more about that in the writing up. Thank you.
Yeah.
Indeed, thank you. Do we have other questions? Because if we don't, I would like to thank once again Dan for this beautiful presentation, and thank all of you for joining, and see you next time.
Thanks everyone for joining in and for the questions. It's very, very useful, and very good seeing everyone.
Thank you all.
See you next time.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye-bye.